The flight training facility at Horizon Aviation Academy buzzed with systematic efficiency, but Mira had learned to recognize the subtle sounds that indicated her exclusion from the real action. While other students received their daily flight assignments and aircraft assignments, she invariably heard her name called for specialized ground instruction or advanced theoretical modules. Chief Flight Instructor Klaus Weber represented everything traditional about European aviation training. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. A former Lufthansa captain with 30 years of commercial flying experience, Weber ran the academy with military precision and unwavering adherence to established protocols. His voice carried the authority of someone who had never encountered a situation that couldn't be resolved through proper procedures and proven methods. Thompson, Weber announced during the morning briefing, his German accent adding weight to each syllable. You're assigned to aircraft systems analysis with Dr. Hoffman. The rest of you, prepare for instrument flight training in actual aircraft. Mira nodded politely, though her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Aircraft systems analysis meant another day in the simulator room, working with equipment that could teach her about flying without allowing her to actually fly. It was a compromise that satisfied the Academy's insurance requirements while keeping her safely away from real aircraft. The European Aviation Safety Agency regulations were clear and uncompromising. Pilot certification required demonstrated ability to perform visual scanning procedures, visual identification of other aircraft, and visual assessment of runway conditions. These weren't suggestions, they were legal requirements backed by decades of aviation safety data. No flight school in Europe was willing to risk their certification by attempting accommodations that might violate these fundamental standards. Dr. Sarah Hoffman, the Academy's chief aviation psychologist, had become Mira's unofficial advocate, though even her support came wrapped in gentle discouragement. Your theoretical knowledge is extraordinary, Hoffman would say during their regular sessions. Perhaps you should consider air traffic control, or aircraft design, or meteorology. There are many ways to contribute to aviation without actually piloting aircraft. These conversations always followed the same pattern. Hoffman would acknowledge Mira's exceptional abilities, while steering her toward alternative career paths that seemed more realistic for someone with her disability. The suggestions were well-intentioned and professionally sound, but they felt like elaborate ways of saying that her dreams were fundamentally incompatible with reality. The other students had grown comfortable with Mira's role as the brilliant assistant who would never be their peer in the cockpit. They consulted her about navigation calculations, sought her help with aircraft systems problems, and genuinely appreciated her insights. But their appreciation carried an implicit understanding. She was valuable as a resource, not as a fellow pilot. Mira's like having a walking aviation encyclopedia, she overheard Jakob Brennan telling his flight partner as they prepared for their afternoon training session. She knows more about these planes than most of our instructors. Too bad. She can't actually use any of it in the air. The comment wasn't meant to be cruel, but it crystallized the fundamental assumption that everyone at the Academy shared. Knowledge and ability were separate things, and her disability created an unbridgeable gap between what she knew and what she could do. They couldn't imagine that her different way of processing information might actually be an advantage rather than a limitation. The Academy's aircraft fleet represented millions of euros in sophisticated technology, but Mira had never been allowed to sit in a pilot's seat, touch the controls, or experience the integration of systems she understood so thoroughly in theory. She could describe the feel of various flight attitudes, explain the sensory cues that indicated different aircraft states, and detail the proper responses to emergency situations, all based on extensive study and her father's teachings. But without practical experience, Her knowledge remained academic rather than experiential. Financial pressures added another layer of exclusion. Flight hours were expensive, and the Academy allocated them based on students' probability of successful certification. Since Mira couldn't meet the visual requirements for pilot licensing, investing flight time in her training seemed economically irresponsible, even wasteful. The business logic was unassailable, even as it reinforced her isolation from the practical aspects of aviation. Weber had made the Academy's position clear during Mira's enrollment interview. We appreciate your passion and respect your knowledge, but we must be realistic about outcomes. This is a professional training facility, not a therapy program. We prepare pilots for commercial aviation careers, and those careers have non-negotiable requirements. His words had been direct but not unkind, spoken with the confidence of someone stating obvious facts rather than opinions. The aviation industry had evolved its safety standards through decades of experience and countless lives lost to preventable accidents. Those standards weren't arbitrary barriers, they were proven protocols that had made commercial aviation the safest form of transportation in human history. But as Mira sat through another morning of theoretical instruction while listening to aircraft engines starting up outside the classroom windows, she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was missing something important. The same safety-focused thinking that excluded her might also be limiting the industry's understanding of what was actually possible when conventional assumptions were challenged by unconventional abilities. Every evening after official academy hours ended, Mira remained behind in the empty training facilities, pursuing a curriculum that no instructor had assigned and no student knew existed. While her classmates socialized in nearby prog pubs or studied in their dormitories, she transformed the Academy's simulator room into her private laboratory for exploring the boundaries of what blindness meant in aviation. The flight simulators at Horizon Academy were sophisticated enough to replicate every aspect of aircraft operation except the visual elements that everyone assumed were essential. Mira had discovered that the night custodial staff, led by an elderly Czech man named Pavel, were remarkably accommodating to a polite student who spoke their language and showed genuine respect for their work. In exchange for helping Pavel with equipment maintenance and inventory organization, she gained unofficial access to the simulator room during off hours. Pavel had lost his own vision, partially during his military service in the 1980s, though he'd never discussed the details. He understood something about adaptation that the Academy's instructors missed entirely. "The airplane," he told Mira in heavily accented English. "She speaks to those who listen. Most pilots, they see too much, hear too little." Under the cover of equipment maintenance, Mira had spent hundreds of hours in the simulators, developing techniques that nobody at the Academy knew existed. She learned to interpret the subtle vibrations transmitted through the control yoke, feeling the aircraft's attitude changes through minute pressure variations. The rudder pedals became seismographs, translating wind conditions and engine performance into tactile information that her feet could read like Braille. Most remarkably, she had discovered that audio cues provided far more information than visual pilots typically utilized. Engine sounds revealed not just performance parameters, but atmospheric conditions, altitude changes, and even structural stress patterns. The whisper of air over control surfaces told stories about airspeed, angle of attack, and approaching stall conditions with precision that astonished her. Mira's father had taught her the basics of audio interpretation, but her private simulator sessions had taken those skills to extraordinary levels. She could identify wind shear conditions by the subtle harmonics in engine noise, detect ice formation by changes in propeller sound characteristics, and recognize mechanical problems through vibration patterns that transmitted through the aircraft. Structure to her hands and feet, her preparation extended far beyond simulator time. Mira had established contacts throughout European aviation, reaching out to air traffic controllers, aircraft mechanics, and weather specialists who didn't know her limitations and therefore treated her as a serious aviation professional. Through these connections, she gathered real-world insights about flight operations that supplemented her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Academic knowledge with practical wisdom. She maintained detailed records of every flight that departed from Prague's Václav Havel Airport, analyzing patterns in air traffic, weather responses, and operational procedures. Her tactile charts had evolved into three-dimensional models that represented airspace geography with unprecedented detail. She could navigate complex flight paths through touch alone, identifying landmarks and navigation aids through memorized spatial relationships that most sighted pilots couldn't match. The Academy's aircraft maintenance hangar became another secret classroom. Mira volunteered for unpaid maintenance assistance, working alongside certified mechanics who taught her to diagnose problems through sound and vibration. She learned to identify bearing wear, hydraulic leaks, and electrical faults through sensory cues that mechanics valued but pilots typically ignored. Her most ambitious project involved creating a comprehensive database of aircraft performance characteristics organized by sensory signatures rather than visual parameters. Every aircraft type had unique acoustic and vibrational fingerprints that changed predictably under different operational conditions. While her classmates studied performance charts and graphs, Mira memorized the sensory language that aircraft used to communicate their operational state. The psychological challenges of her secret preparation were as demanding as the technical ones. Every evening session reinforced her exclusion from normal training while building skills that nobody recognized as valid. She was becoming extraordinarily competent in ways that aviation authorities didn't acknowledge, preparing for opportunities that didn't officially exist. Dr. Hoffman had noticed Mira's extended hours at the academy, but interpreted them as evidence of someone struggling to accept realistic limitations. During their monthly counseling sessions, Hoffman gently suggested that Mira might be developing an unhealthy obsession with unattainable goals. "It's natural to want what we can't have," Hoffman explained with professional compassion. "But sometimes, acceptance of our limitations opens doors to opportunities we hadn't considered. Your knowledge could revolutionize aircraft design, air traffic management, or aviation safety research." Mira listened politely while keeping her true activities carefully hidden. She couldn't explain that she wasn't obsessing over unattainable goals. She was systematically dismantling the assumptions that made those goals seem unattainable. Every simulator session, every conversation with aviation professionals, every tactile chart she created moved her closer to proving that blindness might change how someone flew, but it didn't necessarily prevent them from flying. The isolation was the hardest part. She couldn't share her discoveries with classmates who wouldn't understand their significance, couldn't discuss her progress with instructors who would discourage her efforts, and couldn't seek advice from aviation professionals who would question her motives. Her preparation had to remain invisible, just like her potential. The morning Jakob Brunnen crashed the Academy's primary training aircraft marked a turning point in how the institution viewed risk, capability, and the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application. The accident occurred during what should have been a routine navigation exercise, but poor weather judgment and spatial disorientation had resulted in a hard landing that damaged the aircraft's landing gear and wing structure. Brennan emerged physically uninjured, but psychologically shaken, and the incident became a case study in the gap between classroom confidence and real-world performance. During the post-accident investigation, it emerged that Brennan had missed several critical weather cues and misinterpreted basic navigation signals, despite scoring excellently on all theoretical examinations. Mira watched the investigation proceedings with growing frustration. She had identified the weather conditions that led to Brennan's problems hours before his departure, noting barometric pressure changes and wind patterns that suggested deteriorating visibility. Her analysis, shared quietly with Pavel during their evening maintenance work, had accurately predicted the challenging conditions that ultimately overwhelmed Brennan's limited experience. The weather was talking, she told Pavel as they reviewed maintenance logs in the hangar. The pressure changes, the wind shifts, even the way sound carried differently this morning. All the signs were there for anyone who was listening. Pavel nodded with the wisdom of someone who had learned to read environments through non-visual cues. "You see with better eyes than most who have them," he said simply, but Mira's insights carried no weight in official discussions about the accident. When Chief Instructor Weber conducted the mandatory safety briefing following Brennan's crash, he focused on adherence to visual flight rules and the importance of maintaining visual contact with ground references. The idea that someone might navigate effectively through audio and tactile cues was so far outside standard aviation thinking that it didn't merit consideration. The dismissive environment extended beyond official policy into daily social interactions. During study sessions, Mira's classmates regularly sought her help with complex navigation problems and aircraft systems analysis, but they consistently excluded her from conversations about actual flying experiences. They valued her knowledge, while treating her aspirations as fundamentally unrealistic. Mira's like having a brilliant professor who's never actually done what they're teaching, she overheard Astrid Mueller commenting to her study group. Incredibly valuable for understanding theory, but you wouldn't want them actually flying the plane. The comment stung because it crystallized a prejudice that Mira encountered constantly. Her knowledge was appreciated when it served others' needs but dismissed when it suggested her own capabilities. The same intellectual abilities that made her invaluable as a tutor were considered irrelevant to actual piloting, because they couldn't compensate for visual limitations that everyone assumed were insurmountable. Weber had grown increasingly concerned about what he perceived as Mira's unrealistic expectations. During a private meeting in his office, surrounded by decades of aviation memorabilia and certification plaques, he attempted to redirect her ambitions toward more achievable goals. "Your passion for aviation is admirable," Weber said, his tone suggesting that passion was insufficient for practical purposes. "But we must distinguish between enthusiasm and capability. The regulations exist for good reasons, Thompson. They're written in blood, as we say in aviation." Weber's certainty reflected institutional thinking that had calcified around visual flight requirements. The aviation industry's safety record was built on standardized procedures that had been tested through decades of experience, and those procedures assumed visual confirmation of critical flight parameters. Departing from proven methods seemed recklessly experimental, regardless of how well someone might understand theoretical principles. The Academy's insurance provider had made their position clear during Weber's annual policy review, accommodating non-standard training requests could void coverage and expose the institution to catastrophic liability. From a business perspective, exploring alternative training methods for visually impaired students represented pure risk with no corresponding benefit. Financial considerations reinforced the exclusionary environment. Each flight hour cost the Academy significant money in fuel, maintenance, and instructor time. Allocating those resources to a student who couldn't obtain standard pilot certification seemed economically irresponsible, especially when other students were competing for limited training time. Dr. Hoffman had begun documenting what she characterized as Mira's adjustment challenges in official Academy records. Her psychological evaluations noted persistent, unrealistic goal orientation and difficulty accepting practical limitations. The documentation was professionally appropriate and clinically accurate, but it created an official record that reinforced perceptions of Mira as someone struggling with denial rather than someone developing innovative capabilities. The most Painful aspect of the dismissive environment was its consistency across every level of the institution. From administrative staff who automatically excluded her from flight-related communications to maintenance workers who assumed she couldn't understand technical discussions, everyone treated her expertise as interesting but ultimately irrelevant. To practical aviation, even supportive faculty members like Dr. Hoffman framed their encouragement in terms of alternative career paths rather than challenging conventional assumptions about pilot capabilities. Their kindness felt like elaborate forms of rejection, acknowledging her value, while directing it away from her primary goals. Mira began to understand that proving herself would require more than demonstrating knowledge or theoretical understanding. The institutional barriers weren't based on careful assessment of her actual capabilities. They were based on assumptions that had never been tested because testing them seemed unnecessary. Everyone knew that blind people couldn't pilot aircraft, so exploring the possibility felt like wasting time on impossible questions. But Mira's evening simulator sessions had taught her that impossible questions sometimes had surprising answers, especially when approached by someone willing to challenge the fundamental assumptions that made them seem impossible in the first place. The morning Jakob Brunnen crashed the Academy's primary training aircraft marked a turning point in how the institution viewed risk, capability, and the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application. The accident occurred during what should have been a routine navigation exercise, but poor weather judgment and spatial disorientation had resulted in a hard landing that damaged the aircraft's landing gear and wing structure. Brennan emerged physically uninjured, but psychologically shaken, and the incident became a case study in the gap between classroom confidence and real-world performance. During the post-accident investigation, it emerged that Brennan had missed several critical weather cues and misinterpreted basic navigation signals, despite scoring excellently on all theoretical examinations. Mira watched the investigation proceedings with growing frustration. She had identified the weather conditions that led to Brennan's problems hours before his departure, noting barometric pressure changes and wind patterns that suggested deteriorating visibility. Her analysis, shared quietly with Pavel during their evening maintenance work, had accurately predicted the challenging conditions that ultimately overwhelmed Brennan's limited experience. The weather was talking, she told Pavel as they reviewed maintenance logs in the hangar. The pressure changes, the wind shifts, even the way sound carried differently this morning. All the signs were there for anyone who was listening. Pavel nodded with the wisdom of someone who had learned to read environments through non-visual cues. "You see with better eyes than most who have them," he said simply, but Mira's insights carried no weight in official discussions about the accident. When Chief Instructor Weber conducted the mandatory safety briefing following Brennan's crash, he focused on adherence to visual flight rules and the importance of maintaining visual contact with ground references. The idea that someone might navigate effectively through audio and tactile cues was so far outside standard aviation thinking that it didn't merit consideration. The dismissive environment extended beyond official policy into daily social interactions. During study sessions, Mira's classmates regularly sought her help with complex navigation problems and aircraft systems analysis, but they consistently excluded her from conversations about actual flying experiences. They valued her knowledge, while treating her aspirations as fundamentally unrealistic. Mira's like having a brilliant professor who's never actually done what they're teaching, she overheard Astrid Mueller commenting to her study group. Incredibly valuable for understanding theory, but you wouldn't want them actually flying the plane. The comment stung because it crystallized a prejudice that Mira encountered constantly. Her knowledge was appreciated when it served others' needs but dismissed when it suggested her own capabilities. The same intellectual abilities that made her invaluable as a tutor were considered irrelevant to actual piloting, because they couldn't compensate for visual limitations that everyone assumed were insurmountable. Weber had grown increasingly concerned. about what he perceived as Mira's unrealistic expectations. During a private meeting in his office, surrounded by decades of aviation memorabilia and certification plaques, he attempted to redirect her ambitions toward more achievable goals. "Your passion for aviation is admirable," Weber said, his tone suggesting that passion was insufficient for practical purposes. "But we must distinguish between enthusiasm and capability. The regulations exist for good reasons, Thompson. They're written in blood, as we say in aviation." Weber's certainty reflected institutional thinking that had calcified around visual flight requirements. The aviation industry's safety record was built on standardized procedures that had been tested through decades of experience, and those procedures assumed visual confirmation of critical flight parameters. Departing from proven methods seemed recklessly experimental, regardless of how well someone might understand theoretical principles. The Academy's insurance provider had made their position clear during Weber's annual policy review, accommodating non-standard training requests could void coverage and expose the institution to catastrophic liability. From a business perspective, exploring alternative training methods for visually impaired students represented pure risk with no corresponding benefit. Financial considerations reinforced the exclusionary environment. Each flight hour cost the Academy significant money in fuel, maintenance, and instructor time. Allocating those resources to a student who couldn't obtain standard pilot certification seemed economically irresponsible, especially when other students were competing for limited training time. Dr. Hoffman had begun documenting what she characterized as Mira's adjustment challenges in official Academy records. Her psychological evaluations noted persistent, unrealistic goal orientation and difficulty accepting practical limitations. The documentation was professionally appropriate and clinically accurate, but it created an official record that reinforced perceptions of Mira as someone struggling with denial rather than someone developing innovative capabilities. The most painful aspect of the dismissive environment was its consistency across every level of the institution. From administrative staff who automatically excluded her from flight-related communications to maintenance workers who assumed she couldn't understand technical discussions, everyone treated her expertise as interesting but ultimately irrelevant. To practical aviation, even supportive faculty members like Dr. Hoffman framed their encouragement in terms of alternative career paths rather than challenging conventional assumptions about pilot capabilities. Their kindness felt like elaborate forms of rejection, acknowledging her value while directing it away from her primary goals. Mira began to understand that proving herself would require more than demonstrating knowledge or theoretical understanding. The institutional barriers weren't based on careful assessment of her actual capabilities. They were based on assumptions that had never been tested because testing them seemed unnecessary. Everyone knew that blind people couldn't pilot aircraft, so exploring the possibility felt like wasting time on impossible questions. But Mira's evening simulator sessions had taught her that impossible questions sometimes had surprising answers, especially when approached by someone willing to challenge the fundamental assumptions that made them seem impossible in the first place. The confrontation Mira had been dreading finally came on a gray October morning when Chief Instructor Weber discovered her unauthorized simulator usage. Pavel had called in sick with flu, leaving the maintenance schedule disrupted and the evening cleaning routines delayed. When Weber returned to collect forgotten paperwork from his office, he found lights on in the simulator room and the sound of aircraft engines running at 11:30 p.m. Weber stood in the doorway for several minutes, watching Mira execute complex instrument approaches with a precision that defied his understanding of what should be possible. She was flying a simulated approach to Prague's runway 06 in instrument meteorological conditions, managing multiple radio communications while adjusting for crosswinds and navigation errors. Her hands moved across the controls with confidence, responding to subtle audio cues that Weber couldn't even detect. Thompson, Weber's voice cut through the simulated engine noise like a blade. Explain yourself. Mira's hands froze on the controls, her heart rate spiking as she faced the moment she'd been preparing for and dreading in equal measure. She shut down the simulator and turned toward Weber's voice, maintaining the composure that had served her through months of careful preparation. I've been practicing instrument procedures, sir, she said simply. Weber stepped into the room, his footsteps heavy on the polished floor. This equipment is restricted to authorized training sessions. You're violating Academy policy and potentially damaging expensive equipment for unauthorized purposes. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft. Mira understood that this moment would determine whether her months of preparation had been discovered soon enough to be suppressed, or late enough to be taken seriously. Sir, I've been working with Pavel to ensure proper equipment maintenance, she said carefully. My usage has been conducted safely and documented appropriately. Weber's expression shifted from anger to bewilderment. Thompson, what are you trying to accomplish here? You cannot obtain pilot certification regardless of how many hours you spend in simulators. These exercises serve no practical purpose. The dismissal was delivered with Weber's characteristic directness, but it carried undertones of genuine confusion. He couldn't understand why someone would invest enormous effort in developing skills that had no recognized application in commercial aviation. I believe my preparedness could be valuable in emergency situations, Mira replied. Aviation safety benefits from diverse capabilities and alternative approaches to problem solving. Weber shook his head with the patience of someone explaining obvious facts to a confused student. Aviation safety depends on standardized procedures and proven protocols. Individual innovation is exactly what we train pilots to avoid. Your dedication is admirable, but it's misdirected. The conversation revealed the fundamental philosophical divide that separated Mira's thinking from institutional aviation culture. Weber saw her simulator practice as evidence of someone who couldn't accept realistic limitations, while Mira saw it as preparation for opportunities that might eventually emerge. Dr. Hoffman was called in for an emergency consultation the following morning. Her office, normally a space for routine academic counseling, became the setting for what felt like an intervention designed to redirect Mira's ambitions toward more conventional channels. Your after-hours activities suggest an unhealthy fixation on unattainable goals, Hoffman explained with clinical gentleness. Continued investment in impossible objectives can lead to significant psychological distress and prevent healthy adaptation to your circumstances. Hoffman's assessment was professionally sound and therapeutically appropriate, but it treated Mira's capabilities as symptoms rather than assets. The psychological framework couldn't accommodate the possibility that someone might be rationally preparing for opportunities that hadn't yet been recognized by institutional authorities. Weber had documented the incident in Mira's academic file, noting persistent engagement in unauthorized activities despite clear guidance regarding appropriate academic focus. The language was bureaucratic but damning, creating an official record that would influence every future evaluation of her conduct and potential. The Academy's administration faced a delicate situation. Mira hadn't violated any explicit safety protocols, damaged equipment, or disrupted official training activities. Her unauthorized simulator usage was technically a policy violation, but her exceptional theoretical knowledge and helpful attitude toward other students made punitive action seem disproportionate. The compromise solution reflected institutional discomfort with situations that didn't fit established categories. Mira would be allowed to continue her studies, but required to sign a formal agreement, acknowledging that her training would not lead to pilot certification and that unauthorized equipment usage would result in immediate dismissal. We want to support your passion for aviation, Weber explained as he presented the agreement. But we must ensure that your academic experience remains aligned with realistic career objectives. The document Mira signed felt like a legal acknowledgement of her own limitations, a formal acceptance that her dreams were incompatible with reality. But it also represented something else, official recognition that her capabilities were significant enough to require institutional management. Her classmates' reactions to news of the incident revealed the complex social dynamics that had developed around her presence at the academy. Some expressed admiration for her dedication while questioning its practical value. Others worried that her actions reflected poorly on their program's standards and supervision. "I admire her determination," Astrid Mueller commented during a study session. "But sometimes you have to accept what's possible and what isn't. Refusing to acknowledge limitations doesn't make them disappear." The comment reflected a worldview that Mira found increasingly frustrating. Everyone assumed that limitations were fixed characteristics, rather than challenges that might be overcome through innovative approaches and persistent effort. Their acceptance of conventional boundaries prevented them from imagining unconventional solutions. As October progressed, Mira found herself increasingly isolated within the academy community. Her knowledge remained valuable to struggling students, but her aspirations were viewed with mixture of pity and concern. She had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unrealistic ambition rather than an example of exceptional preparation and dedication. The emergency call came through Prague Air Traffic Control at 14:37 on a sunny November afternoon that had started as the most routine day in Horizon Academy's history. A Cessna 172, carrying 2 passengers from Vienna to Berlin, had suffered complete electrical failure over the Bohemian Highlands, leaving the pilot without radio communication, navigation instruments, or transponder identification. Worse, dense fog had rolled in from the mountains faster than meteorologists had predicted, reducing visibility to near zero across every major airport within the aircraft's remaining fuel range. The pilot, identified as experienced commercial aviator Captain Lars Eriksson, was flying blind in every sense that mattered, with approximately 40 minutes of fuel remaining and no way to communicate his position or intentions to ground control. Air traffic controllers at Prague's Václav Havel Airport had been tracking the aircraft on radar until the transponder failed. But now they faced the nightmare scenario that every controller dreaded: an aircraft in distress somewhere in their airspace with no means of contact and deteriorating weather conditions that made visual approach impossible. At Horizon Academy, the emergency interrupted what had been a standard afternoon of theoretical instruction and simulator training. Weber received the initial notification from air traffic control, requesting immediate assistance from any available aircraft in the training fleet. The Academy's location, equipment, and trained personnel made it the logical coordination point for emergency response efforts. All available instructors and advanced students to the briefing room immediately. Weber's voice boomed across the Academy's public address system. "We have an aircraft emergency requiring immediate response." The briefing room filled quickly with the Academy's most experienced personnel. Weber stood before a large screen displaying radar tracks and weather data that painted a picture of steadily worsening conditions and rapidly diminishing options. Cessna 172, registration OKFGA, last known position approximately 60 kilometers northeast of Prague, Weber announced. Complete electrical failure, no communication capability, estimated 35 minutes remaining fuel. Current weather conditions make visual approach impossible at every airport within range. The silence that followed was the sound of experienced aviators recognizing an impossible situation. Every person in the room understood that an aircraft without electrical systems couldn't land safely in zero visibility conditions. Regardless of pilot skill or ground support efforts, instructor Anders Reykjavik studied the weather data with growing concern. Fog ceiling is below minimums at every field within fuel range. Even if we could establish communication, there's nowhere safe for him to land. Dr. Hoffman, present as part of the Academy's emergency response protocol, asked the question that everyone was thinking: what are our realistic options for assistance? Weber's response reflected the grim reality of aviation emergencies. We have 4 aircraft available for search coordination, but visibility conditions prevent effective visual contact. Air traffic control is requesting any creative solutions. We might suggest. The phrase creative solutions hung in the air with the weight of desperation. Aviation emergencies were typically resolved through established procedures and proven protocols, not innovation or experimentation. When standard methods failed, options became extremely limited extremely quickly. Mira had been in the Academy's library when the emergency announcement occurred, working on navigation calculations for her theoretical coursework. She hurried to the briefing room and slipped in during Weber's initial presentation, positioning herself near the back where she could listen without drawing attention. As the discussion continued, Mira's mind raced through possibilities that the assembled experts weren't considering. Her months of simulator training had included extensive practice with emergency procedures, particularly scenarios involving electrical failures and instrument approaches in adverse weather conditions. More importantly, her unique sensory capabilities offered potential solutions that conventional thinking couldn't accommodate. She could navigate by audio cues alone, using engine sounds and radio beacon signals that remained functional even when electrical systems failed. Her tactile understanding of aircraft behavior might allow approaches that visual pilots couldn't attempt safely. "Sir," Mira said quietly, her voice barely audible above the worried conversations filling the room. Weber turned, his expression shifting from intense concentration to mild irritation. "Thompson, this is not an appropriate time for theoretical discussion. We need practical solutions for an immediate emergency." "I believe I could guide the aircraft to a safe landing," Mira said simply. The room fell silent with the kind of stunned quiet that follows statements so unexpected that nobody immediately knows how to respond. Every face turned toward Mira, expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief to something approaching anger. Weber's voice carried the strain of someone managing a crisis while dealing with an inappropriate distraction. "Thompson, you are not qualified to participate in emergency flight operations. Please return to your regular activities." But Air Traffic Controller Captain Joseph Novak, who had arrived to coordinate ground support efforts, asked the question. "That changed everything. What exactly are you proposing?" Mira stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "I can navigate by audio cues alone. Radio beacons, engine harmonics, atmospheric sound patterns. I could talk the pilot through an instrument approach using sensory information that doesn't depend on electrical systems." The suggestion was so far outside conventional emergency response procedures that it initially seemed more like science fiction than practical aviation. But as fuel time ticked away and weather conditions continued deteriorating, impossible solutions began to look like the only solutions available. Captain Novak studied Mira with the intensity of someone evaluating options that shouldn't exist, but might be necessary anyway. "Have you ever attempted anything like this before?" "Every night for 8 months, Mira replied. "I've been preparing for exactly this kind of situation." The control room at Prague Air Traffic Control had transformed into a nerve center of coordinated desperation. Captain Novak spread aeronautical charts across the central table while Weber and his senior instructors huddled around weather displays, showing deteriorating conditions throughout central Bohemia. The Cessna's fuel situation had become critical. Perhaps 20 minutes remaining before engine failure would force an emergency landing in terrain that offered no safe options. Mira stood at the edge of the group, her mind processing the acoustic environment in ways that her sighted colleagues couldn't imagine. Through the control room's speakers, She could hear fragments of radio communications from aircraft operating in clearer weather zones, the subtle harmonics of different engine types, and the atmospheric interference patterns that indicated specific meteorological conditions. The standard instrument landing system requires functional electrical systems, Weber explained to Novak with growing frustration. Without transponder identification and radio communication, we cannot guide a safe approach through instrument procedures. Mira stepped forward, her voice cutting through the technical discussions with quiet confidence. Sir, I believe there's an alternative approach that doesn't require electrical systems. Weber's expression darkened. Thompson, we've discussed this. Emergency operations require qualified personnel, not theoretical speculation. But Captain Novak raised a hand for silence, his air traffic control experience making him more receptive to unconventional solutions than Academy protocol typically allowed. Explain your proposal. Mira moved to the chart table, her fingers tracing familiar landmarks that she had memorized through months of tactile study. The Prague VOR beacon operates independently of aircraft electrical systems. The pilot can still receive bearing information through a battery-powered handheld radio or emergency backup systems. She continued, her explanation gaining momentum, as she described navigation techniques that none of the assembled experts had considered. More importantly, I can guide him using audio landmarks that don't appear on conventional charts. Industrial facilities produce distinctive electromagnetic signatures that create specific audio patterns. Railroad systems generate predictable sound corridors. Even highway traffic creates acoustic reference points that can be used for navigation. Dr. Hoffman had arrived during the emergency response, and her psychological training made her sensitive to group dynamics that others missed. She watched the room's reaction to Mira's proposal, noting how experience-based authority clashed with innovative problem-solving approaches. The atmospheric conditions that create our visibility problems also enhance sound transmission, Mira continued. Fog acts as an acoustic amplifier, making it easier to identify distant reference points through audio cues alone. Weber shook his head with the certainty of someone whose experience had taught him to distrust departures from proven procedures. Thompson, your theoretical knowledge is impressive, but emergency aviation requires practical experience with actual aircraft. In real conditions, simulator training cannot replicate the complexity and pressure of a genuine emergency. The comment revealed the fundamental assumption that separated Mira from institutional acceptance, the belief that simulation was inherently inferior to conventional experience, even when conventional experience had proven inadequate for the current crisis. Air traffic controller Maria Svoboda, monitoring radar contacts from her station across the room, interrupted with an update that made everyone's theoretical discussions suddenly urgent. Contact bearing 045 degrees, approximately 40 kilometers out. Aircraft is descending, probably running low on fuel. The distant aircraft was Captain Erickson, making critical decisions about his survival based on fuel calculations and weather conditions that were deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated. Every minute of discussion in the control room was a minute less fuel for the pilot struggling somewhere in the fog-covered mountains. Novak studied the charts while calculating options that were rapidly disappearing. Standard approach procedures require at least 500 feet of ceiling visibility. Current conditions are showing zero ceiling at all regional airports. Mira's proposal represented something that aviation authorities had never officially tested: the possibility that non-visual navigation might be more reliable than instrument approaches under specific emergency conditions. Her months of simulator training had convinced her that audio cues provided more immediate and accurate information than conventional instruments during electrical failures. I can establish communication with him using the emergency frequency, Mira said. Once contact is established, I can guide him to a safe landing using bearing information from ground-based beacons and acoustic landmarks that will remain reliable regardless of visibility conditions. The technical aspects of her proposal were sound, but they required accepting assumptions about human capability that challenged fundamental aviation doctrine. Weber's resistance reflected institutional thinking that prioritized proven methods over innovative approaches. Even when proven methods had failed, Dr. Hoffman asked the question that everyone was considering. What are the risks if this approach fails? Mira's answer was direct and honest. The same risks we face if we do nothing. Captain Erickson will run out of fuel and crash in mountainous terrain. The difference is that my approach gives him guidance and hope instead of leaving him to navigate alone. The silence that followed was broken by another transmission from Svoboda. Radar contact now bearing 030 degrees, 35 kilometers. Aircraft appears to be turning toward Prague, possibly attempting emergency approach. Captain Erickson was making his own decisions about survival, and his choices were bringing him toward Prague's airport, regardless of whether ground control could provide effective assistance. The question was no longer whether to help him, but whether the help would be adequate for the emergency he faced. Weber looked at the weather displays showing 0 visibility conditions, then at the radar screen showing an aircraft approaching with critical fuel reserves. His institutional training told him to follow established procedures, but his experience told him that established procedures had no solutions for this emergency. If we authorize this, Weber said slowly, you understand that you're accepting responsibility for the outcome? Mira nodded without hesitation. I understand completely, sir. The tension in Prague air traffic control reached a breaking point as Weber confronted the most difficult decision of his 30-year aviation career. The radar screen showed Captain Erickson's aircraft continuing its approach toward Prague. Fuel reserves critically low, while weather conditions remained below minimums for any standard landing procedures. Weber's radio crackled with updates from air traffic control centers across Central Europe, all reporting the same problem: 0 visibility. Conditions at every airport within the Cessna's remaining fuel range. The meteorological situation had developed faster than computer models predicted, creating a crisis that standard emergency procedures couldn't address. Negative, Weber announced with the finality of command authority. Thompson is not certified for emergency flight operations. Academy insurance protocols prohibit unauthorized personnel from participating in actual emergency response procedures. His decision reflected institutional thinking that prioritized legal compliance over innovative problem-solving, even in circumstances where conventional solutions had proven inadequate. The Academy's liability exposure from unauthorized emergency assistance could be catastrophic, regardless of outcomes. Captain Novak's air traffic control experience made him more flexible than Academy administration, but he couldn't override Weber's authority over Academy personnel. Sir, with respect, we're facing an emergency situation where standard procedures have failed. Perhaps we should consider alternative approaches. Weber's response revealed the depth of institutional resistance to departing from established protocols. Captain, aviation safety depends on qualified personnel following proven procedures. Allowing unqualified individuals to participate in emergency operations, regardless of their theoretical knowledge, creates risks that could result in additional casualties. Dr. Hoffman supported Weber's position from a psychological perspective, viewing Mira's proposal as evidence of unrealistic thinking rather than innovative capability. Emergency situations can trigger overconfidence in individuals who haven't been tested under actual pressure. Theoretical preparation doesn't guarantee practical performance. The institutional refusal wasn't motivated by malice or deliberate discrimination, but by institutional systems designed to prevent exactly the kind of experimental approaches that Mira represented. Weber's concerns about liability, safety, and proper procedures were professionally sound and legally defensible. Air traffic controller Svoboda provided updates that made everyone's theoretical discussions increasingly urgent. Contact now bearing 15 degrees, 25 kilometers out. Aircraft has begun final approach corridor. Estimated fuel remaining less than 15 minutes. Captain Eriksson was committing to Prague's airport as his emergency landing site, whether or not ground control could provide effective guidance. His fuel situation left no alternatives and no time for additional planning or coordination. Weber consulted with Academy legal counsel via emergency phone connection, seeking guidance about institutional liability for unauthorized emergency assistance. The legal advice was unambiguous. Allowing uncertified personnel to participate in flight operations created liability, exposure that could threaten the Academy's continued operation. Thompson, Weber said with the weight of institutional authority, "You are not authorized to participate in this emergency response. Return to your regular academic activities immediately." The dismissal was delivered with Weber's characteristic directness, but it carried undertones of genuine regret. He recognized Mira's capabilities and dedication, but couldn't reconcile them with institutional requirements that prioritize certified qualifications over innovative solutions. Mira's response surprised everyone in the control room. "Sir, I understand your position, but I respectfully request permission to monitor emergency communications from the Academy's radio equipment. My technical knowledge might provide insights that could assist qualified personnel." The request was carefully worded to avoid direct challenge to Weber's authority while positioning Mira to provide assistance if circumstances changed. Her diplomatic approach reflected months of learning to navigate institutional resistance without triggering confrontational responses. Weber considered the compromise, recognizing that Mira's monitoring activities wouldn't violate emergency protocols, while allowing her expertise to remain available if needed. Monitoring only. Thompson. No communication with emergency aircraft. As alternative rescue efforts continued, the fundamental inadequacy of conventional approaches became increasingly apparent. 2 Academy aircraft had attempted visual search patterns but reported zero visibility conditions that made aircraft identification impossible. Ground emergency services had positioned vehicles along potential approach paths, but fog conditions prevented effective coordination. Captain Novak coordinated with Prague Tower controllers, exploring every possible solution within standard procedures. Radio beacon approaches required functional aircraft electrical systems. Visual approaches required ceiling visibility that didn't exist. Instrument landing systems required transponder identification that the emergency aircraft couldn't provide. "We're running out of conventional options," Novak admitted to Weber as radar showed the aircraft continuing its approach toward Prague. "Emergency services are positioned along the runway approaches, but without communication capability, we cannot provide approach guidance." Weber's institutional training had prepared him for many emergency scenarios, but not for situations where all standard procedures failed simultaneously. His decision to refuse Mira's assistance was procedurally correct and legally defensible, but it left them without effective solutions for an immediate crisis. The Academy's radio equipment monitored multiple emergency frequencies, providing updates about Captain Eriksson's situation that grew more desperate with each transmission from air traffic control centers trying unsuccessfully to establish contact. Every attempt at communication met with silence, indicating that the aircraft's electrical failure was complete. Mira sat at the Academy's auxiliary radio station, officially monitoring emergency communications, while privately calculating approach vectors that could guide the lost pilot to safety. Her fingers traced tactile charts that represented terrain features and navigation aids from an acoustic perspective that no one else in the room could interpret. She had prepared for exactly this moment through months of unauthorized training, developing capabilities that institutional thinking couldn't acknowledge because they challenged fundamental assumptions about pilot certification and emergency procedures. Now those capabilities remained unused while a fellow aviator flew toward disaster in weather conditions that conventional wisdom declared UNSURV-IVABL as the radar blip representing. Captain Ericsson's aircraft continued its final approach toward Prague. Mira faced a choice between institutional obedience and personal conscience, between following orders and following the deeper calling that had brought her to aviation in the first place. At 15:14, with Captain Ericsson's aircraft showing less than 10 minutes of fuel remaining on radar approach to Prague, Mira Thompson made the decision that would define not only her own future, but the future of aviation itself. The control room buzzed with frustrated activity as conventional rescue efforts proved inadequate, and she could hear the desperation building in every radio transmission from ground control. Weber stood before the main display screen, coordinating with emergency services positioned along Prague's primary runway. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue equipment were staged for what everyone expected would be a catastrophic crash landing in zero visibility conditions. The institutional response was thorough and professional, but it was essentially preparation for disaster rather than prevention of it. Emergency vehicles report zero visibility along the entire approach corridor, reported Captain Novak, his voice tight with the strain of managing an impossible situation. Even if the pilot manages to find the runway, ground services cannot provide guidance for safe touchdown. Dr. Hoffman monitored communications from the Academy's psychological crisis team, preparing for trauma counseling that would be needed after the inevitable crash. Her professional training had taught her to accept tragic outcomes when all reasonable interventions had failed, but the acceptance felt hollow when she watched Mira sitting quietly at the monitoring station with knowledge that might prevent the tragedy. Mira listened to the emergency communications with growing anguish. Through the radio static, she could hear Captain Ericsson's engine beginning to show signs of fuel starvation, subtle changes in RPM and exhaust note that indicated imminent power failure. Her father had taught her to recognize these audio signatures during their private lessons years ago, knowledge that proved prophetic in ways he never could have imagined. The moment of decision came when air traffic control lost radar contact with Ericsson's aircraft as he descended below their coverage altitude. The lost plane was now flying somewhere in the fog-covered approaches to Prague, invisible to ground control and running on fumes, with perhaps 5 minutes before engine failure forced an emergency landing in unknown terrain. Mira stood up from the monitoring station, her movement causing Weber to turn with irritation. "Thompson, I told you to monitor communications only. Return to your station." "Sir," Mira said quietly, "Captain Ericsson is about to die." The simple statement carried the weight of absolute certainty. Her audio analysis of the engine signatures had revealed fuel starvation patterns that indicated imminent power failure, information that radar controllers couldn't detect, but that her trained ear could interpret with deadly accuracy. Weber's response reflected institutional thinking that had guided his entire career. Emergency services are positioned to assist when the aircraft attempts landing. We have done everything possible within proper procedures. But Mira had reached the point where procedural correctness meant accepting preventable death. Her months of preparation, her father's teachings, and her unique capabilities converged on this moment when following orders meant watching someone die needlessly. "I'm going to establish radio contact with him," she announced. Moving toward the primary communications console. Weber stepped between Mira and the radio equipment, his authority as clear as his determination to prevent unauthorized action. "Thompson, you are not authorized to communicate with emergency aircraft. Stand down immediately." The confrontation crystallized everything that had frustrated Mira throughout her time at the Academy. Institutional thinking that valued credentials over capabilities, procedures over people, certification over results. Weber's refusal to let her help wasn't motivated by malice. but by a system that couldn't accommodate solutions that fell outside established parameters. Dr. Hoffman joined Weber in blocking Mira's access to communications equipment. Mira, emergency situations create strong emotional responses that can lead to poor decision-making. Your desire to help is understandable, but untrained intervention could make the situation worse. The psychological assessment was professionally sound but tragically irrelevant. Mira's training wasn't untrained, it was unrecognized. Her capabilities weren't theoretical, they were practical skills, developed through months of rigorous preparation for exactly this scenario. But institutional thinking couldn't distinguish between untrained and uncertified, between innovative and reckless, between breaking rules and saving lives. The system that was designed to prevent unqualified people from endangering aircraft was now preventing qualified people from saving them. Mira looked at Weber, then at Dr. Hoffman, then at the radio equipment that could establish contact with Captain Erickson before his fuel ran out completely. The choice was no choice at all. Follow orders and watch someone die, or break rules and give him a chance to live. I understand the consequences of my actions, she said simply, then stepped around Weber toward the radio console. Weber grabbed her arm, his institutional authority manifesting as physical restraint. Thompson, I will have you arrested for interfering with emergency operations if you continue this behavior. The threat was real and immediate. Academy security could detain her within minutes, criminal charges could follow within hours, and her aviation career could end within days. But Captain Erickson would be dead within minutes if she did nothing. Mira gently but firmly removed Weber's hand from her arm. Sir, some things are more important than careers. She keyed the emergency frequency, her voice calm and professional despite the magnitude of what she was risking. Captain Erickson, this is Prague Emergency Control. Do you copy? The radio static continued for several seconds that felt like hours. Then, through the interference and atmospheric distortion, came the voice of a man who had been flying alone in fog for over an hour with failing fuel and no navigation aids. Prague Control. This is Oscar Kilo Foxtrot Golf Alpha. Thank God, I'm lost, low on fuel, and flying blind. I need immediate assistance. Weber stared at Mira with a mixture of anger and disbelief, but Captain Novak stepped forward with the pragmatism of someone who understood that successful rule breaking was better than unsuccessful rule following. Thompson, Novak said quietly, you've established contact. What's your plan? The moment Captain Erickson's voice crackled through the radio speakers, the atmosphere in Prague air traffic control shifted from institutional resistance to reluctant cooperation. Weber's authority had been challenged successfully. Dr. Hoffman's psychological protocols had been bypassed, and Mira found herself in communication with a pilot whose life depended entirely on her unrecognized expertise. Captain Erickson. Mira's voice carried the calm professionalism that her father had taught her was essential during aviation emergencies. I need you to confirm your current engine status and fuel situation. Erickson's response revealed the desperation of a pilot who had been flying blind for over an hour. Fuel gauge showing empty, engine beginning to run rough. I estimate maybe 3 to 4 minutes before power failure. Visibility is absolutely zero. Mira's audio analysis skills immediately interpreted the background engine noise transmitted through Erickson's microphone. The slight irregularity in RPM, the subtle changes in exhaust harmonics, the barely perceptible vibration patterns all indicated fuel starvation that would lead to complete engine failure within minutes rather than the 3 to 4 minutes Erickson estimated. Captain, you have less time than you think, Mira said urgently. I need you to begin immediate descent toward Prague and follow my guidance exactly. Weber stood behind her, his institutional training warring with the reality that conventional procedures had failed while Mira's unconventional approach had succeeded in establishing contact. His decision to allow her to continue represented institutional flexibility that academic policy manuals couldn't accommodate. Captain Novak had positioned himself at the radar console, providing Mira with real-time updates about Ericsson's position relative to Prague's airport facilities. Aircraft bearing 025 degrees, 15 kilometers northeast of the airport. Altitude approximately 2,000 feet. Mira's mental map of Prague's acoustic landscape activated with precision that surprised even her. Every radio beacon, every industrial facility, every geographic feature that produced distinctive sound signatures became a navigation aid that could guide Ericsson toward safety without requiring visual references or functional aircraft instruments. Captain Ericsson, I need you to listen carefully to background audio while I provide navigation guidance, Mira instructed. You're going to navigate using sound landmarks that don't appear on conventional charts. The concept was so far outside standard aviation procedures that Ericsson initially questioned whether he understood correctly. Prague's control, did you say audio navigation? I've never heard of procedures like that. Trust me, Captain, Mira replied with confidence built through months of preparation that no one else believed was relevant. Reduce power to minimum sustainable settings and begin descent toward bearing 240 degrees. I'll guide you to the airport using landmarks you can hear. Her approach utilized navigation techniques that predated modern instrument systems, but had been forgotten as aviation technology advanced. Sound-based navigation had guided aircraft before radar, before GPS, before the electronic systems that Ericsson's aircraft could no longer access due to electrical failure. Dr. Hoffman watched the proceedings with growing amazement, her psychological training helping her recognize that Mira was performing under pressure with competence that matched or exceeded certified emergency response personnel. The theoretical knowledge that everyone had dismissed as academic was proving practical and potentially life-saving. Captain, listen for the distinctive whine of high-voltage power transmission lines beneath you, Mira continued. Prague's electrical grid creates specific audio signatures that will guide you toward the city center. Ericsson's response indicated that he was beginning to understand the unconventional approach. I can hear what sounds like electrical interference. Is that what you're referring to? Exactly, Mira confirmed. Follow that audio signature toward bearing 220 degrees. The power grid will lead you toward Prague's industrial district, which will provide additional navigation references. Weber monitored emergency services positioning, coordinating ground support for what had become an experimental approach procedure that no aviation manual described. Fire trucks and ambulances followed potential approach routes while communications teams prepared for outcomes that could range from successful innovation to catastrophic failure. The unauthorized mission had become a test of whether human adaptation could overcome technological limitations, whether innovative thinking could succeed where conventional procedures had failed. Mira's months of preparation were being validated or refuted in real time, with a fellow aviator's life hanging in the way. Balance. Prague control. I'm hearing different sound patterns now, Ericsson reported. Something that sounds like machinery or industrial equipment. Mira's excitement was carefully controlled but unmistakable. Perfect, Captain. You're approaching Prague's manufacturing district. The machinery sounds will intensify as you continue toward bearing 200 degrees. This will guide you toward the airport's outer approach corridor. Her navigation technique combined pre-electronic aviation methods with her unique auditory capabilities, creating an approach procedure that had never been officially tested, but was proving effective under circumstances where nothing else had worked. Captain Novak provided radar updates that confirmed Mira's audio guidance was accurate. Aircraft now bearing 010 degrees, 8 kilometers from the airport, maintaining descent profile. The success of the initial navigation phases didn't guarantee successful landing, but it demonstrated that Mira's unconventional approach could provide guidance where conventional methods had failed. The most challenging part lay ahead: guiding an aircraft to safe touchdown in zero visibility conditions using only sound-based references. As Ericsson's aircraft approached Prague's airport perimeter, Mira prepared for the most critical phase of the emergency, talking a desperate pilot through a landing approach that aviation authorities had never imagined was possible. The final approach phase began with Captain Ericsson's aircraft at 1,200 feet above Prague, fuel exhausted to the point where engine failure was imminent, and visibility conditions that made conventional landing impossible. Mira's voice became the only navigation system that could guide him to survival, and her months of unauthorized preparation would be tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. "Captain Ericsson, I need you to listen for the approach lighting system," Mira instructed, her voice steady despite the magnitude of responsibility resting on her guidance. Prague's runway 24 has high-intensity strobe lights that create a distinctive audio frequency, even in dense fog conditions. Ericsson's response carried the strain of a pilot who had been flying on emergency reserves for the past 10 minutes. "I can hear rhythmic pulsing sounds, but I can't see anything. How do I know if I'm aligned with the runway?" Mira's answer drew on navigation techniques that predated modern instrument systems but had been perfected through her unique sensory capabilities. The strobe pattern creates acoustic shadows that indicate your position relative to the runway centerline. Listen for the strongest pulse intensity that will guide you to proper alignment. Her technique was unprecedented in modern aviation, but grounded in principles her father had taught her about sound-based navigation. Aircraft engines created predictable acoustic reflections when approaching different types of terrain, and runway surfaces produced distinctive audio signatures that could be interpreted by someone trained to recognize them. Weber watched the proceedings with growing amazement and terror. Academy liability protocols had never contemplated scenarios where blind students guided emergency aircraft to safety using procedures that existed nowhere in aviation manuals. But conventional approaches had failed completely, leaving Mira's experimental methods as the only option between rescue and disaster. "Prague control. Engine is beginning to surge," Ericsson reported, his voice tight with the controlled panic of imminent power failure. "I estimate less than 1 minute before complete power loss." Captain Novak provided radar updates that confirmed the desperate timeline. Aircraft at 800 feet, 4 kilometers from runway threshold, descent rate increasing rapidly. Mira's response demonstrated the calm professionalism that her father had instilled in her during their private lessons. "Captain, prepare for dead stick landing approach. I'll guide you through audio cues that will position you for safe touchdown even without engine power." The concept of landing an aircraft without engine power in zero visibility conditions violated every principle of conventional aviation safety. But Mira's simulation training had included extensive practice with dead stick approaches using audio navigation, preparation that seemed obsessive until this moment when it became essential. "Listen for the runway surface audio signature," Mira continued. "Asphalt creates different sound reflections than grass or concrete. I'll guide you to the proper approach angle using acoustic landmarks along the flight path." Dr. Hoffman monitored the emergency response with professional fascination. Her psychological training had taught her to recognize exceptional performance under extreme pressure, and Mira was demonstrating capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about human adaptation and achievement. Ericsson's aircraft passed through 600 feet altitude with engine power fluctuating wildly as fuel starvation became complete. His training had prepared him for emergency landings, but not for approaches guided entirely by audio, cues provided by someone he'd never met using techniques he'd never heard of. "I can hear different surface sounds now," Ericsson reported. "Something. That sounds like ... pavement texture." "Perfect," Mira confirmed. "You're approaching the runway surface. Reduce airspeed to minimum controllable speed and prepare for flare initiation when I give the command. Her guidance timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the aircraft would stall above the runway. Too late, and the impact would be too severe. For survival, she was calculating approach angles and descent rates using audio cues that provided more precise information than conventional instruments under these specific conditions. Emergency vehicles positioned along Prague's runway 24 reported hearing aircraft engine sounds but maintaining zero visual contact. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue equipment stood ready for what could be either a successful innovation or a catastrophic crash. Engine power failing completely, Erickson announced. I'm committed to dead stick approach. Mira's voice carried absolute confidence despite the unprecedented nature of what she was attempting. Captain, you're perfectly positioned. Begin flare ... now. The moment of touchdown occurred in complete silence from the perspective of everyone monitoring radio. Communications. Erickson's aircraft had either landed safely or crashed, but fog conditions prevented visual confirmation of the outcome. After 15 seconds that felt like hours, Erickson's voice returned through the radio static. Prague control, aircraft safely on the ground. Rolled out on runway centerline with minimal damage. How the hell did you do that? The control room erupted in celebration that mixed relief, amazement, and disbelief. Mira had successfully guided an aircraft to safe landing using navigation techniques that existed nowhere in aviation manuals, proving that unconventional approaches could succeed where conventional procedures had failed completely. Weber stared at Mira with an expression that combined institutional shock with grudging professional respect. Thompson, what you just accomplished should have been impossible. Sometimes impossible just means we haven't found the right approach yet, Mira replied quietly. The immediate aftermath of Captain Erickson's successful emergency landing brought a confusing mixture of celebration and institutional crisis to Prague air traffic control. While emergency medical teams confirmed that Erickson had escaped injury and his aircraft had suffered only minor damage, administrative authorities faced the unprecedented challenge of evaluating unauthorized emergency assistance that had succeeded brilliantly while violating numerous regulations. Weber found himself in the impossible position of having to discipline a student whose rule-breaking had prevented a catastrophic accident. Academy protocols required formal investigation of any unauthorized emergency assistance, but those protocols had been written under the assumption that such assistance would be either ineffective or harmful, not life-saving and professionally executed. Thompson, Weber announced as emergency services completed their assessment of Erickson's condition. Report to my office immediately for formal review of your unauthorized actions. The statement was delivered with Weber's characteristic authority, but it lacked the certainty that usually accompanied his administrative decisions. How do you punish someone for saving a life using methods that worked better than approved procedures? Dr. Hoffman faced similar professional confusion. Her psychological assessment protocols required evaluation of students who showed inappropriate risk-taking behavior or disregard for institutional authority. But those frameworks couldn't accommodate behavior that was simultaneously rule-breaking and life-saving. Captain Erickson's first request after medical clearance was to meet the person who had guided him to safety. His arrival at the Academy's administrative offices created an uncomfortable confrontation between institutional procedure and personal gratitude. I need to thank whoever talked me through that landing, Erickson announced to Weber. I've been flying for 15 years, and I've never experienced navigation guidance that precise under those conditions. Weber's response reflected institutional discomfort with praise for unauthorized activities. Captain, we're pleased that you survived your emergency, but we must investigate whether proper procedures were followed during the assistance you received. Erickson's expression shifted from gratitude to confusion. Investigate? Someone saved my life using techniques I didn't know existed. What's there to investigate? The conversation revealed the gap between operational results and administrative compliance. That characterized institutional thinking. Weber's concern about proper procedures was professionally appropriate and legally necessary, but it seemed irrelevant to someone whose life had been saved through improper procedures. European Aviation Safety Agency representatives arrived within hours to conduct formal investigation of the emergency response. Their preliminary interviews focused on whether Academy personnel had violated certification requirements or exceeded authorized responsibilities during the rescue operation. ESA. Inspector Henrik Larsson interviewed Mira in the Academy's conference room. His questions designed to determine whether her actions represented dangerous precedent setting or innovative emergency response that deserved official recognition. Miss Thompson, Larsson began with bureaucratic formality. Can you explain your qualifications for providing emergency navigation assistance to aircraft in distress? Mira's answer was direct and honest. I have no official qualifications for emergency assistance, sir. I provided guidance based on theoretical knowledge and simulation training that I developed independently. Larsson's follow-up questions explored the institutional implications of successful, unauthorized assistance. Are you aware that your actions violated numerous aviation safety regulations and Academy training protocols? Yes, sir, Mira replied. I was aware that I was violating regulations. I was also aware that Captain Erickson would die if I followed regulations instead of providing assistance. The response crystallized the fundamental conflict between regulatory compliance and emergency effectiveness that the aviation industry had never been forced to address. Successful rule-breaking challenged the authority of rules themselves, creating administrative problems that had no precedent in aviation law. Weber's formal report to Academy administration documented Mira's violations, while acknowledging the successful outcome that resulted from those violations. His recommendation reflected institutional confusion about how to respond to beneficial insubordination. Student demonstrated exceptional technical knowledge and emergency response capabilities, while showing complete disregard for proper authorization procedures. Dr. Hoffman's psychological evaluation noted similar contradictions. Subject displayed appropriate decision-making under extreme pressure while exhibiting inappropriate disregard for institutional authority. Recommend further evaluation to determine whether behavior represents psychological instability or exceptional adaptation capabilities. The media attention that followed Captain Erickson's rescue created additional pressure for institutional response. Aviation journalists throughout Europe reported the story as either dangerous precedent setting or breakthrough innovation, depending on their perspective about regulatory flexibility versus safety compliance. Captain Erickson's interviews with aviation publications consistently praised Mira's guidance while questioning why someone with her capabilities wasn't officially recognized within aviation training systems. His advocacy created public relations pressure for institutions that preferred handling regulatory violations privately. 3 days after the emergency, Weber called Mira into his office for what both expected would be disciplinary action that could result in her dismissal from the Academy. The meeting would determine whether her unauthorized success would be treated as beneficial innovation or dangerous insubordination. Thompson, Weber began, consulting official documentation that had accumulated around her case. Your actions during the emergency violated Academy policy, exceeded your authorized responsibilities, and created significant administrative complications. Mira nodded, prepared for consequences that she had accepted as necessary when she chose to help Captain Erickson. I understand, sir. Weber continued, his tone suggesting internal conflict about the decision he was required to make. However, your technical competence and emergency response effectiveness have raised questions about whether our current training protocols adequately recognize diverse capabilities and alternative approaches to aviation safety. The statement suggested institutional thinking that was beginning to accommodate possibilities that regulatory frameworks hadn't previously considered. 6 months later, Mira Thompson stood in the cockpit of a modified Cessna 172 at Prague's Václav Havel Airport, her hands resting confidently on controls that had been specially equipped with enhanced audio feedback systems and tactile navigation aids. The aircraft bore the registration number OKMTX and the distinctive markings of the European Aviation Innovation Research Program, a newly established initiative that she now led as its chief test pilot. The transformation had begun immediately. After the EASA investigation concluded that her emergency guidance of Captain Erickson represented innovative adaptation rather than regulatory violation, recommending formal study of alternative navigation techniques for emergency situations. Weber himself had become an unexpected advocate, his report emphasizing that Mira's capabilities could revolutionize aviation safety rather than threaten it. Pre-flight systems check complete, announced her co-pilot, Captain Sarah Brennan-Jacobs, sister who had specifically requested assignment to the research program after learning about Mira's work. All enhanced audio navigation systems operational. The research program aircraft incorporated technology that translated conventional visual flight instruments into audio and tactile formats, creating navigation systems that could function effectively regardless of pilot visual capabilities. Mira's techniques, once considered impossible, had become the foundation for backup navigation systems being tested by commercial aviation manufacturers throughout Europe. Dr. Hoffman, now serving as the program's psychological research coordinator, monitored flight operations from the ground control station. Her role had evolved from questioning Mira's adaptation to documenting how alternative sensory approaches could enhance aviation safety for all pilots, not just those with visual limitations. Prague Tower, this is Innovation Research 01. Requesting departure clearance for test flight designation, Bravo 7. Mira's voice carried the professional confidence of someone whose capabilities were finally officially recognized. Innovation Research 01. Cleared for takeoff runway 24. Wind calm. Visibility unlimited, came the response from air traffic control operators who had watched her program achieve breakthrough after breakthrough in navigation technology. Today's test flight would demonstrate advanced emergency navigation procedures to representatives from Airbus, Boeing, and the International Civil Aviation Organization. The techniques that had once been considered experimental were being evaluated for integration into commercial pilot training programs worldwide. Captain Erickson, now serving as a consultant to the research program, watched from the observation deck as Mira's aircraft lifted off into the clear Prague sky. His advocacy had been instrumental in securing funding and regulatory approval for the program, turning his emergency rescue into a catalyst for aviation innovation. It's remarkable how something that seemed impossible 6 months ago now looks like the obvious next step in aviation safety, commented ICAO Representative Dr. Maria Santos. Reviewing test data that showed consistently superior performance using audio-enhanced navigation techniques, the research program had attracted aviation professionals from around the world, drawn by the potential to enhance flight safety through innovative approaches that challenged conventional thinking about pilot capabilities. Mira's initial breakthrough had opened an entire field of research into human-machine interface optimization. Weber, now promoted to Director of Innovative Training Programs, coordinated with universities across Europe that were developing curriculum based on Mira's techniques. His institutional resistance had transformed into institutional leadership, proving that organizations could adapt when presented with evidence that challenged their fundamental assumptions. The interesting thing about Mira's approach, Weber explained to visiting researchers, is that it doesn't replace conventional navigation, it enhances it. Pilots who learn these techniques become more capable, regardless of their visual status. The ripple effects extended far beyond aviation. Mira's story had inspired adaptive technology development in fields ranging from maritime navigation to space exploration, demonstrating how innovation often emerged from the intersection of necessity and unconventional capability. Her personal transformation was equally remarkable. The logistics student who had once been relegated to equipment manifests now led briefings for senior aviation officials, published research papers in prestigious journals, and spoke at international conferences about the future of human technology integration in aviation. The most important lesson, Mira told the assembled ICAO representatives as her test flight returned to Prague, is that limitations often exist in our thinking rather than in reality. When we challenge assumptions about what's possible, we discover capabilities that were always there, waiting to be recognized. Pavel, still working as maintenance supervisor, but now consulting on adaptive technology development, watched the landing approach with pride. She always knew the airplane speaks to those who listen, he told visitors. Now everyone else is learning to hear the conversation. The program's success had transformed Prague's Horizon Academy into Europe's leading center for adaptive aviation research. Students from around the world competed for admission to programs that combined traditional flight training with innovative approaches that expanded rather than limited human potential. As Mira's aircraft touched down perfectly on Prague's runway 24, the same runway where she had guided Captain Erickson to safety 6 months earlier, she reflected on the journey from invisible student to recognized innovator. The path had required challenging institutional thinking, risking personal consequences, and proving that preparation combined with courage could overcome barriers that seemed insurmountable. Prague Tower, Innovation Research, 01 clear of. Runway, test flight complete, she announced. All objectives achieved, returning to base. But the real achievement wasn't the successful test flight, or the recognition she had finally received. It was the knowledge that aviation was safer because someone had refused to accept limitations, had prepared for opportunities that didn't yet exist, and had proven that impossible was often just another word for unexplored. 6 months later, Captain Mira Thompson had become exactly what she had always believed she could be, a pilot whose unique capabilities made aviation safer for everyone, regardless of what conventional wisdom had once declared impossible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.